In the shadowed halls of medieval castles, where torchlight flickered like the last breaths of forgotten souls, kings feasted not on sustenance, but on the very instruments of their undoing. Imagine the scene: a monarch, crowned in gold and velvet, his table groaning under platters of roasted swan, spiced peacock, and glistening eels pulled from forbidden waters. The air thick with the scent of cloves and honey, the laughter of courtiers echoing off stone walls, etched with the ghosts of conquests past. This was power incarnate, the divine right of rule manifested in every bite, every swallow of wine, laced with ambition. Yet beneath this opulence lurked a silent predator, a deadly food woven into the fabric of royal excess that turned triumph into torment, and legacy into lament. Forget the tales of heroic battles and iron-willed monarchs who bent empires to their will. This is the story history whispered in the dark, the one scribes dared not fully inscribe in illuminated manuscripts, for it revealed the fragility at the heart of absolutism. Kings, those supposed immortals touched by God, felled not by the assassin's blade or the rival siege, but by the fork they wielded themselves. A paradox as old as the throne. The greater the feast, the closer the grave. In an age when thrones were won through blood and fire, it was the banquet that proved the true battlefield, where indulgence masked as glory delivered its fatal strike. Consider the weight of it all, the irony that bites deeper than any sword. These rulers, who commanded armies to ravage lands and extract tribute from trembling vassals, surrendered to the allure of their own larders. Foods, once symbols of dominion, harvested from distant seas or hunted in royal forests, became the chains that bound them. Lampreys, those serpentine delicacies slithering from murky depths, forbidden to all but the highest born. Spiced meats preserved through alchemical arts, their flavors a testament to the kingdom's reach. And wine, oh, the wine, flowing like rivers of liquid rubies, hiding secrets in its depths. What began as a celebration of survival in a world of famine and plague twisted into excess, a slow poison that eroded the body from within. The medieval world was one of stark contrasts, where life hung by a thread woven from wool and iron. Peasants toiled in mud-churned fields, their bellies hollowed by lean winters, while kings gorged on banquets that could feed a village for a month. This disparity was no accident. It was the divine order, the hierarchy etched into the stars by church and crown alike. To eat lavishly was to affirm one's place in that cosmic chain, to mock the spectre of starvation that haunted the realm. Yet in this affirmation lay the seed of destruction. The body, that fragile vessel of royal ambition, rebelled against the onslaught. Guts twisted in agony, blood thickened like curdled milk, and visions of grandeur dissolved into fevered delirium. Picture Henry I, King of England, in the year of our Lord, 1135, a man who had tamed the fractious nobility, forged alliances across the Channel, and ruled with a fist clad in the finest chainmail. His court at Woodstock or Westminster buzzed with the machinery of empire. Envoys from Normandy, treasuries swollen with silver from Welsh mines, and there amidst it all the feast. Advisers had warned him perhaps of his physician's counsel against such indulgences, but Henry, ever the conqueror, dismissed the shadows. Lampreys, those eel-like horrors prized for their oily richness, were his favourite vice. Broiled in wine and herbs, their flesh a slippery testament to the sea's bounty claimed by his fleets. He devoured them ravenously, plate after plate, as if to consume the very essence of his domain. What followed was no swift end, but a descent into the abyss. The king's belly swelled, a rebellion from within, as the lamprey's toxins, perhaps spoiled in the heat of preparation or burdened by the weight of overconsumption, unleashed their fury. Agony clawed at his vitals, fever burned through his veins, and the once mighty ruler writhed on silken sheets, his cries echoing through chambers where jesters had only hours before amused him. A surfeit of lampreys, the chroniclers would later murmur, a polite veil over the brutality of it. But in truth, it was excess incarnate, the deadly food that mocked the illusion of invincibility. Henry, who had survived wars and intrigues, perished not in glory, but in the aftermath of a meal. This was no isolated tragedy, but a pattern etched across the centuries, from the misty isles of Britain to the sun-baked courts of France and the shadowed palaces of the Holy Roman Empire. William the Conqueror, that Norman titan who claimed England through the blood-soaked fields of Hastings in 1066, met a similar fate a generation later. In 1087, during a hunt in the New Forest, he paused for a feast of lampreys and sturgeon, his table a sprawl of excess amid the wilds he had subdued. The food, heavy and ill-suited to a man already weathered by conquest, turned against him, his intestines ruptured in a torrent of pain, spilling his life upon the earth he had seized. Chroniclers spoke of divine judgment, perhaps, or the wrath of the land's ancient spirits. But peel back the myth, and there lies the stark reality. The king's own appetites, unchecked, became his executioner. And so the paradox unfolds. In an era defined by scarcity, where famine stalked the heels of every harvest, the royal table stood as a beacon of defiance. Yet that defiance carried a hidden cost, a dark undercurrent to the grandeur. Foods elevated to symbols of power, exotic imports from Byzantine markets, preserves laced with spices worth their weight in gold, harbored perils born of ignorance and hubris. Spoilage in the absence of true preservation, toxins accumulated in fatty tissues, the sheer volume overwhelming mortal frames accustomed to moderation. The deadly food was not some arcane poison slipped by a traitor's hand. Though such tales abound, it was the feast itself, the ritual of excess, that history romanticized as regal splendor. As we embark on this shadowed journey through the annals of medieval monarchy, we will uncover the layers of this lethal indulgence. From the geopolitical feasts that sealed alliances and buried enmities, to the intimate agonies of kings brought low by their plates, we will dissect the cultural forces that elevated gluttony to a virtue and the physiological betrayals that followed. Prepare to witness not just the fall of crowns, but the human frailty beneath them, the melancholy truth that even the mightiest fall to the temptations they command. In the grand tapestry of history, where battles rage eternal, it is the quiet killer at the banquet that whispers the deepest lesson. Abundance, unchecked, devours its master. To truly grasp this shadowed saga, we must first pierce the veil of medieval kingship itself, not as a pedestal of unassailable might, but as a precarious throne built on the sands of human appetite. This documentary will unravel the enigma of the deadly food that felled monarchs, revealing how what was meant to exalt the crown instead eroded it from within. We speak here not of vague poisons or fleeting maladies, but of a specific peril, the lamprey, that ancient eel-like creature dredged from the depths, transformed by royal kitchens into a delicacy of doom. Prized for its serpentine grace and fatty allure, the lamprey became the emblem of excess, a food whose oily richness masked toxins that accumulated silently, striking with the inevitability of a tide turning against the shore. It was no mere accident of spoilage, but a confluence of ignorance, ambition, and the body's quiet rebellion, a lethal thread woven through the lives of kings who dined as if mortality were a myth. Our journey begins in the cradle of this catastrophe, the historical foundations of the medieval world, where scarcity and splendor collided like storm clouds over a feudal plain. From the fall of Rome's echoes in the 5th century to the Black Death's scythe in the 14th, Europe was a forge of chaos. Viking raids carving bloody runes along coasted coasts, the investiture controversy pitting popes against emperors in a war of souls, and the Crusades siphoning blood and gold into distant sands. Amid this tumult, kings emerged not as divine arbiters, but as warlords clad in legitimacy, their authority forged in the crucible of constant strife. The Holy Roman Empire sprawled like a fractured mosaic, its emperors, from Charlemagne's heirs to the Hohenstaufens, grappling with fractious dukes and papal interdicts that starved realms of sacraments. In England and France, the Angevin and Capetian dynasties wrestled for supremacy, their borders redrawn in ink, stained with the blood of barons' revolts. Geopolitics was a game of predation, where alliances were sealed not in dusty treaties, but in the steam rising from banquet halls, where a shared roast symbolized truces as fragile as the meat itself. Culture, too, conspired in this deadly dance. The medieval worldview, steeped in the Church's iron doctrines, viewed the body as a microcosm of the soul, a vessel to be disciplined, yet exalted in hierarchy. Sumptuary laws decreed what each class could consume, elevating the king's table to a sacrament of power. Feasts were rituals of dominance, drawing from Aristotle's humours and Galen's prescriptions, where balance was preached but excess practiced. Lampreys, harvested from rivers like the Severn or Loire, were no common fare. Their harvest demanded royal edicts, serfs labouring in perilous waters to net these lamprey-like predators, whose lamp-black skins and sucking mouths evoked the infernal. Prepared in pies or broiled in verjuice, they embodied the alchemical marriage of sea and spice, cinnamon from the Orient, saffron from Moorish gardens, traded along Silk Road tributaries that kings monopolized. Yet this opulence bred peril. Without refrigeration's mercy, transport from distant fisheries invited corruption, bacteria blooming in the heat like whispers of decay. The humoral theory, that cornerstone of medieval medicine, warned of cold and moist foods overwhelming the hot and dry bile, but kings, buoyed by astrologers and physicians like Constantine the African, ignored such portents, their confidence a armor against the body's frailties. As we delve deeper, we will trace the early origins of this royal vice, how the lamprey ascended from pagan relic to monarchical obsession. In the misty annals of early medieval lore, these creatures slithered through Celtic myths and Frankish chronicles, symbols of the underworld claimed by Christian kings as trophies of conversion. We will explore the psychological forge that shaped such indulgences. The traumas of succession wars, where a boy's first feast marked his inheritance, imprinting gluttony as a badge of survival. From the Carolingian courts, where Charlemagne's banquets set the template of excess, to the Norman invasions that transplanted continental tastes to insular shores, we uncover how cultural forces, chivalric codes romanticizing the hunt, troubadours singing of bountiful halls, molded appetites into weapons of self-destruction. The heart of our tale lies in the rise of these figures and the core events that illuminated the lamprey's lethal shadow. We will journey through the reigns of doomed monarchs with forensic precision, recreating the intensity of their fatal feasts. Witness William the Conqueror's last hunt in 1087, the New Forest alive with the baying of hounds, his table laden with lamprey stew amid the scent of pine and sweat-soaked leather. How that meal, heavy with the spoils of Hastings, ruptured his frame in a cascade of agony, his empire fracturing in the blood he spilled upon the soil, turned to Henry I, the Lion of the Angevins, whose 1135 indulgence at Gloucester Castle, platters of lampreys swimming in wine, courtiers toasting his Norman mastery, unleashed a visceral torment that echoed through Westminster's halls, paving the way for the anarchy's civil wars. Nor will we spare the continent, Philip I of France succumbing in 1108 to a surfeit that twisted his Capetian line, or Adolf of Nassau, Holy Roman Emperor, whose 1298 banquet presaged his battlefield end, the lamprey's grip a prelude to doom. each duel with death dissected slowly, the preparations' haste, the flavors' seduction, the onset's creeping dread, reveals the pattern. Excess as the true siege, breaching walls no army could. From these visceral heights we descend into philosophy and inner evolution, where some kings glimpse the abyss and turn toward restraint, their later years a melancholy quest for balance amid the humoral storms. Figures like Frederick II, the Stupa Mundi, who penned treatises on falconry and diet while wrestling his own appetites, embody the shift from gluttonous conquest to enlightened moderation, or its failure, as the body betrayed even the sage. We probe the contradictions, how monastic influences urged fasting, yet royal egos devoured the forbidden, leading to downfalls that mirrored spiritual reckonings. Finally, we confront the legacy, from illuminated manuscripts veiling these deaths in euphemisms to Renaissance reinterpretations that recast excess as tragic hubris. In modern lenses, films like The Lion in Winter echoing Henry's feast, academic debates on toxicology versus folklore, pop culture's vampires drawing from lamprey lore, we sift misconceptions, affirming the historical truth. Gluttony, not fate, toppled thrones. Join me then in this intimate excavation. Let the flickering candle of history guide us through the banquet's gloom, where every course concealed a reckoning. For in understanding how kings fell to their plates, we confront our own hungers, the eternal pull between abundance and annihilation. Breathe in the smoke of ancient fires, the story awaits, heavy with the weight of crowns laid low. In the dim flicker of hearth fires that warded off the medieval chill, where the air hung heavy with the tang of wood smoke and damp stone, the foundations of this royal tragedy were laid not in the clash of steel, but in the quiet rhythms of a world forged from chaos and constraint. Europe, in the high Middle Ages, from the 9th century's fragile rebirth after Rome's long eclipse to the 14th's cataclysmic plagues, was a land suspended between barbarism and aspiration, its peoples bound by threads of faith, feud, and the unrelenting cycle of seasons. Imagine the vastness of it, forests thick as secrets, swallowing armies whole, rivers like the Rhine and Thames, veins pulsing with trade and peril, and cities, those nascent hives like Paris or London, huddled behind walls that mocked the wilderness beyond. This was no golden age of enlightened rule, but a mosaic of strife, where kings rose as warlords anointed by circumstance, their crowns less diadems of divine favor than iron helms scarred by the press of rival blades. Geopolitics in this era was a brutal chessboard, played across fractured realms where power ebbed and flowed like the tides that brought Viking longships to pillage monastic shores. The Carolingian Empire, once Charlemagne's grand vision spanning from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, splintered by the 9th century into the patchwork of West Francia, East Francia, and Lotharingia, precursors to France, Germany, and the Low Countries, leaving emperors and kings to wrestle with vassals whose loyalties shifted like sand. In England, the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy gave way to the Norman yoke after 1066. William's conquest importing continental feudalism, where barons held lands in fief, their oaths sworn over cups of mead that masked simmering resentments. Further south, the Capetian dynasty clawed its way from the Ile-de-France, expanding through marriages and maneuvers against the Plantagenets, whose Angevin empire stretched from Scotland's borders to the Pyrenees, a hydra of territories that invited endless intrigue. And overarching it all loomed the Holy Roman Empire, that sprawling enigma of elected emperors, from the Ottonians to the Salians, whose authority was perpetually contested by the papacy in struggles like the investiture controversy of the 11th century, where popes like Gregory VII excommunicated Henry IV, forcing the emperor to stand penitent in the snows of Canossa, barefoot and humbled before the church's unyielding gate. Yet amid these tempests of temporal power, culture wove a tapestry of meaning that elevated the king's table to an altar of legitimacy. The medieval worldview, shaped by the Latin Church's dominion, saw the cosmos as a great chain of being, God at its pinnacle, descending through angels, monarchs, nobles, peasants, and beasts into the infernal depths. This hierarchy was not abstract. It was embodied, visceral, in every aspect of life. The body politic mirrored the body natural, as chroniclers like John of Salisbury would later articulate, with the king as head, nobles as arms, and commons as feet, each part sustained by its due portion. Feasts, then, were no mere repasts, but sacraments of this order, rituals affirming the divine right that flowed from coronation oils, blessed by archbishops. Sumptuary laws, decreed in parliamentary edicts or imperial rescripts, policed consumption. Peasants barred from fine linens or spiced meats, lest they ape their betters. Nobles restricted in jewellery, but kings unbound, their banquets a spectacle of excess that underscored their semi-divine status. To dine poorly was to court damnation as much as deposition. Abundance was proof of God's favour, a bulwark against the famines that ravaged the land every 7 lean years, when rye fields withered under hail or locust swarms, leaving bones to bleach in furrows. And here, in this cultural forge, the lamprey emerged as an emblem of royal transcendence, its origins slithering back to antiquity's shadows. These ancient creatures, jawless predators with rasping tongues that bored into flesh like demons from the deep, had haunted human lore since Roman times. Pliny the Elder describing them in his natural history as favourites of the elite, their migrations up rivers like the Tiber, a seasonal bounty claimed by nets and weirs. In the early medieval shift, as Christianity supplanted pagan rites, the lamprey's eerie form, eel-like, up to 3 feet in length, their skins a mottled black that evoked the abyss, transformed from Celtic sea god offerings to Christian trophies of dominion over nature. Frankish kings, like Pepin the Short in the 8th century, regulated their harvest along the Loire, granting monopolies to abbeys whose monks netted them in perilous spring floods, the creature's blood a grim parallel to Christ's passion. By the 11th century, as feudalism ossified, lampreys became staples of coronation feasts. At Westminster, Edward the Confessor's table in 1042 featured them stewed in ale, symbols of the island realm's watery borders tamed. Their preparation was an alchemical rite, skinned alive to preserve the gelatinous fat, then broiled in verjuice or baked into pies laced with ginger from Arab caravans, their flavour a rich, earthy unctuousness that courtiers praised in verse, though it masked the peril of their diet. Lampreys feasted on the carrion of riverbeds, accumulating mercury and parasites in flesh, ill-suited to overindulgence. The worldview that sustained this obsession drew from Greco-Roman humours, filtered through Arabic scholars like Avicenna, whose canon of medicine reached Salerno's medical school by the 12th century. The body was a balance of 4 elements: blood, hot, moist; phlegm, cold, moist; yellow bile, hot, dry; black bile, cold; a dry, disrupted by excess. Lampreys, classified as cold and moist, were meant for moderation, their slipperiness a warning of phlegmatic overload that could drown the vital spirits. Physicians, often cleric healers like Hildegard of Bingen, prescribed purges and bleedings, but kings, insulated by flattery and the ego of absolutism, heeded little. Astrologers cast horoscopes for auspicious dining, Jupiter in the ascendant for bounty, while almoners distributed scraps to the poor, a token piety that veiled the gluttony. This cultural alchemy turned peril into prestige. Spices like cubeb or long pepper, worth a labourer's yearly wage, preserved the flesh against summer's rot, yet invited imbalance. the heat clashing with the lamprey's chill to brew internal storms. Inevitability shadowed every course, for the medieval body was no fortress but a fragile citadel, vulnerable to the world's caprices. Without the microscope's gaze or germ theory's light, spoilage was sorcery, bacteria festering in unrefrigerated holds as lampreys journeyed from seven weirs to royal kitchens, their oils rancidifying under sun-baked sails. Overconsumption, that royal sin dressed as virtue, swelled the belly like a traitor's plot, pressing on organs until rupture or fever claimed the host. In this era's grandeur laced with melancholy, where cathedrals pierced stormy skies as prayers against entropy, the king's feast stood as defiant monument, yet one that cracked under its own weight. The geopolitical feasts that forged the peace of God in 989, truces sworn over lamprey-laden boards amid Clermont's bishops, or the betrothals sealed at Fontevraud with Capetian opulence, all bore this undercurrent: unity bought with indulgence, alliances as ephemeral as the meal's afterglow. And in the quiet hours after, when minstrels' lutes fell silent and the hall emptied to echoes, the body whispered its rebellion, a prelude to the falls that would echo through chronicles. Thus, the historical foundations reveal not a realm of untrammeled might, but a precarious equilibrium where cultural imperatives clashed with physiological truth. The lamprey, that serpentine interloper in the chain of being, embodied the paradox, a delicacy dredged from chaos to a firm order, yet destined to unravel it. As we press onward from these broad strokes to the intimate origins of royal appetites, the pattern sharpens. The early lives where boys became kings, their first tastes imprinting the path to doom. From the broad strokes of empires in flux and cultural edicts that crowned excess as virtue, we turn now to the intimate forge, where royal appetites were first kindled, the early lives of those monarchs whose paths converged with the lamprey's fatal embrace. Here, in the shadowed nurseries of castles and the echoing halls of nascent courts, boys were not merely born to thrones, but sculpted by them, their psyches imprinted with the tastes that would one day undo them. Myth mingles with the sparse ink of chronicles, where hagiographers painted heirs as predestined luminaries, touched by divine oils before their first cry. Yet the documented fragments reveal a grimmer truth. Children adrift in a world of succession's knives, where the first feast was less nourishment than initiation, a ritual binding them to the chain of gluttonous expectation. Consider the cradle of this compulsion, reaching back to the Carolingian dawn, when the template of royal indulgence was etched into the bloodlines that would echo through centuries. Charlemagne himself, that colossus of the 8th century, crowned emperor on Christmas Day in 800 amid the splendor of St. Peter's Basilica, was no stranger to the banquet's pull. Though his own end came from Pleuris's grip rather than the tables, yet in his court at Aachen, amid the steam of kitchens fueled by forests felled for his realm, the young Pepin the Hunchback, his firstborn legitimate heir until disgraced, first tasted the weight of expectation. Chronicles like Einhard's Vita Caroli Magni whisper of palace feasts where lampreys, netted from the Rhine's murky bends under edict of the king, were presented not as mere fare, but as symbols of the Frankish dominion over waters once roamed by Merovingian ghosts. Pepin, a boy of tender years, would have been seated at the high table, his small hands guided to the slippery flesh, broiled in Malmsey wine imported from Venetian traders, its richness a lesson in power's flavor. But myth intrudes here. Later tales, embroidered in the 9th century royal Frankish annals, cast Charlemagne as a temperate giant, his banquets moderated by clerical advisers like Alcuin of York, who preached the perils of humoral excess. Fact pierces the veil. Archaeological digs at Aachen's palace reveal vast hearths stained with fish oils, and diplomatic records show lamprey shipments as royal gifts, binding vassals in webs of obligation. For the young prince, This was psychological shaping at its rawest. Trauma of a father's endless campaigns, absences that left the court a void filled by surrogates' indulgences, imprinting food as the constant companion in a life of conditional love. Traumas deepened in the fractured wake of empires splintering as the 9th century's divisions birthed the dynasties fated for Lamprey's curse. In West Francia, the Capetians' progenitors, Hugh Capet, ascending in 987 after Carolingian frailty, nurtured heirs amid the Loire Valley's mist-shrouded keeps, where riverine bounty was both lifeline and lure. Take Robert II, the Pious. Born in 972 to Hugh's line, a child whose early years were marred by the spectre of illegitimacy whispers and Viking incursions that razed monasteries along the Seine. Documented in Rodolphus Glaber's histories, Robert's boyhood at Orléans saw him initiated into feasts that affirmed his piety-tinged claim. Lampreys, harvested in royal weirs during Lent's uneasy truce with fasting vows, prepared as exceptions to ecclesiastical rigor, their gelatinous coils, a forbidden thrill. Myth elevates him as the monk king, tonsured against his will, yet facts from papal bulls reveal a youth torn between cloister and crown, the banquet a cultural force pulling him back to secular might. Contradictions abound. Church fathers like Abbo of Fleury railed against gluttony as the devil's gateway, yet sumptuary customs demanded the heir consume conspicuously, his first tastes imprinting a psyche divided, the trauma of a mother's death in childbirth, perhaps, or the baron's murmurs of weakness, resolved in the defiant swallow of oily excess. This was no gentle nurture. It was a forging, where cultural imperatives, chivalric tales from wandering minstrels singing of Arthurian halls, laden with sea's treasures, romanticized indulgence as the mark of virility, even as physicians' rudimentary texts, translated from Arabic, warned of the lamprey's phlegmatic chill settling in youthful bones. Across the Channel, the Norman infusion amplified these origins, transplanting continental appetites to England's insular soil with a brutality that scarred young souls. William the Conqueror, born around 1028 in Falaise's draughty tower, illegitimate scion of Duke Robert I, embodied the contradictions from his earliest breaths. Orphaned at 7, his childhood was a gauntlet of regency plots, assassin shadows in the ducal corridors, barons like Gilbert of Brion slain in ambushes that left the boy duke cowering in haylofts. The Bayeux Tapestry, that woven chronicle of his later triumphs, hints at earlier feasts through depictions of laden tables, but deeper sources like William of Jumièges' Gesta Normanorum Ducum record the young William's first royal repasts at Caen, where lampreys from the Orne River, slimy harbingers of the sea conquests to come, were served to steel his resolve. Myth casts him as the destined bastard, hardened by fate into iron. Facts reveal psychological fractures, the trauma of isolation, fostered by tutors who equated survival with dominance, leading to banquets as assertions of control. Cultural forces converged, Norman vigor, infused with Viking lore of feasting after raids, clashed with emerging feudal oaths sworn over spiced eel pies, their preparation a sensory assault. The rasping scrape of skins removed, the sizzle in iron pans over peat fires, flavors laced with pepper from Moorish outposts. William's early indulgence, documented in charters granting fishing rights to loyal abbeys, imprinted gluttony as armor against vulnerability, a pattern his sons would inherit, twisted into fatal excess. Even in the Holy Roman Empire's labyrinthine courts, early lives mirrored this darkening mold. Frederick Barbarossa, born in 1122 to the Hohenstaufen line, grew amid the Swabian hills' echoing keeps, his youth shadowed by the investiture's lingering scars and the Guelph-Welf rivalries that pitted kin against kin. Chronicles like Otto of Freising's Gesta Frederici portray a boy steeped in imperial pomp from infancy, His first feast at Speyer Cathedral, lampreys dredged from the Neckar, symbols of the Rhine's imperial flow, marking his grooming as emperor-to-be. Myth lionizes him as the red-bearded wonder unassailable. Documented edicts and travelogues reveal traumas. The death of siblings in border skirmishes, a father's exile, fostering a psyche that sought solace in the table's abundance. Contradictions tore at him. Ecclesiastical mentors urging stoic restraint per St. Augustine's City of God, yet courtly culture, with its Minnesang poets extolling bountiful lords, elevated the lamprey to a rite of passage. Harvested in perilous weirs that claimed serfs to drowning, these creatures arrived at table as alchemical wonders, their flesh absorbing spices like galangal, a heady mix that overwhelmed the young frame, seeding the humoral imbalances his later physicians would futilely purge. In these origins, myth and fact entwine like the lamprey's coils. Boys elevated to heirs, their psyches shaped by the cultural hammer of hierarchy, where the first bite was a contract with destiny's darker side. Traumas of loss and intrigue, contradictions between pious precept and regal display, forces that romanticized excess as essence of rule, all converged to imprint the path. The body, that tender vessel, absorbed not just flavors but fates, the oily richness a whisper of rebellions to come, and in that imprint lay the seed of downfall, for what began as survival's feast in youth's fragile dawn swelled, unchecked, into the monarch's mortal siege. As we advance from these formative shadows to the rise of figures and the core events that unveiled the lamprey's lethal arc, the intensity builds, the hunts, the hauls, the moments when indulgence crested into catastrophe. From the imprint of youth's shadowed feasts, where the lamprey's oily whisper first coiled around tender psyches, we now ascend to the rise of these figures, the core events that transformed indulgence from rite to reckoning, excess from emblem to executioner. Here, in the slow-burning drama of reigns unfolding like a blade drawn in the half-light, we dissect the moments when kings, now fully armored in their crowns, confronted the banquet's hidden siege. No swift narratives but forensic recreations, the hunts that preceded the fall, the halls alive with the clamor of power, the creeping dread as the body betrayed its master. We begin with William the Conqueror, that Norman tempest whose conquest etched his name in England's blood-soaked soil, and trace how his appetites, honed in boyhood's isolation, crested into catastrophe amid the wilds he had claimed. Picture the year 1087, the New Forest, a vast, untamed expanse in Hampshire, its ancient oaks and thorny brakes, a deliberate wilderness crafted by William's iron will, a royal preserve where deer roamed free and poachers met the noose. The air hung thick with the musk of leaf mould and the sharp tang of hound's breath, their baying a chorus that drowned the distant murmur of the Avon. William, at 60 years, weathered by the ceaseless grind of rule, rode at the hunt's vanguard, his frame still broad, though softened by decades of ducal and kingly feasts, his beard streaked with grey like frost on conquered iron. He had forged an empire from the chaos of 1066's Hastings, where arrows felled Harold Godwinson and Norman cavalry trampled Saxon shields into the mire. Now, 2 decades on, his realm spanned from the Scottish marches to the Breton coasts, its treasuries swollen with Domesday's meticulous tallies, barons bound by oaths sworn in Westminster's draughty nave. Yet unrest simmered. Rebellions in the north crushed with scorched earth fury, the harrying of 1069-70 leaving Yorkshire a wasteland of famine and wails. William, ever the predator, sought solace in the hunt, that primal assertion of dominion, his falconers and beaters fanning out like an army in miniature. The pursuit began at dawn, the king's destrier snorting steam into the chill, as a great hart broke cover from the underbrush. a beast of 12 points, its flanks gleaming like polished bronze. William's spear arm, scarred from Senlac's melee, thrust true. The animal fell in a spray of crimson, its death rattle echoing through the glade. Triumph coursed through him, hot as the mead that would follow, and his retainers converged, Normans in mail hauberks, their laughter rough with the accents of Rouen. They hauled the quarry to a clearing, where a makeshift table awaited, trestles dragged from a nearby lodge, laden not with simple bread, but the spoils of victory. Sturgeon from the Solent's nets, its cartilaginous flesh poached in white wine, venison haunch roasting over a spit, juices hissing into flames fed by felled yew. And there the centerpiece, lampreys, those serpentine familiars of his youth, trapped days prior in weirs along the Test River, their journey to this forest glade a testament to the realm's reach. Skinned and gutted by kitchen serfs under the watchful eye of the king's chamberlain, they had been stewed in a cauldron of ale and herbs, thyme from monastic gardens, cloves bartered from Flemish merchants, their flesh absorbing the brew until it yielded a unctuous gravy, rich and forbidding. William dismounted, his boots sinking into the loamy earth he had seized from Saxon thens, and approached the board with the conqueror's stride. Courtiers parted, murmuring flattery in a babble of French and Latin as he tore into the lampreys first, fork absent, for such refinements were for softer courts. His dagger pierced the coils, lifting them steaming to his lips. The flavor exploded, earthy, almost metallic, laced with the spice's bite that masked the underlying chill, the fatty oils coating his tongue like liquid shadow. He ate ravenously, plate after platter vanishing amid toasts to his undimmed vigor. The wine, a Rhenish vintage, tart and heady, flowing to wash it down. Laughter swelled, tales of past hunts mingling with boasts of the next campaign against his son Robert Curthose, whose rebellion in Normandy gnawed at the empire's flanks. Yet beneath the revelry, the seeds of ruin stirred. William's belly, distended from years of such indulgences, feasts at Bayeux to seal alliances, banquets in Winchester to awe pilgrims, protested subtly at first. A fullness bordering on pressure, the lamprey's weight settling like stones in a catapult's pouch. Hours passed, the sun climbing to mock the forest's gloom, and the king remounted, urging the hunt onward. But now pain lanced through him, a sharp twist in the vitals, as if the heart's spirit rebelled from within. He pressed on, sweat beading on his brow despite the autumn bite, until collapse came near a brook's edge. His horse stumbled, throwing him to the ground in a tangle of limbs and mud. Agony bloomed, visceral and unrelenting, his intestines, overburdened by the feast's excess, ruptured under the strain. The lamprey's oils, perhaps tainted by river silt or the haste of preparation in smoky field tents, unleashing a cascade of internal hemorrhage. Blood welled from his mouth, staining the soil that had drunk Saxon blood at Hastings, and his retainers gathered in horror, their cheers turned to cries. Borne on a litter to Rouen, the 60-mile agony dragged over days. Each jolt of the cart a fresh torment, fever visions of lost battles and unborn heirs flickering like dying embers. Chroniclers like Orderic Vitalis, in his ecclesiastical history, veiled it as divine retribution for the harrying's cruelties or the arrow wound from a French skirmish festering anew. But peel the pious layers, and the truth emerges stark. A surfeit of lampreys and sturgeon, the body's fragile mechanics overwhelmed, the rupture spilling not just life, but the fragile unity of his realm. William died on September 9, 1087, in the priory of Saint Gervais. His last words a murmur of regret for the poor he had harried. His empire, fracturing as suns, vied like wolves over the corpse. This was no aberration, but the first deep cut in a pattern of rising peril, where core events etched the lamprey's shadow across thrones. Turn now to Henry I, William's youngest son, who clawed the crown from his brother's grasp in 1100, his early cunning, honed in the Winchester libraries amid tomes of Roman law, belied by the appetites inherited from his father's table. By 1135, at 67, Henry ruled a transmarine empire from his Angevin heartlands, his court at Devizes or Gloucester, a nexus of diplomacy, marriages to secure whales, charters granting abbeys fishing rights to feed the endless feasts that bound loyalty. The fateful banquet unfolded in early December amid the Yule-tide's preparations, the great hall at Gloucester Castle aglow with beeswax tapers, tapestries of Bayeux's weave depicting ancestral glories. Envoys from Anjou arrived with tidings of border skirmishes, their arrival heralded by horns that pierced the winter fog. The table groaned under excess, capons in almond milk, salmon from the Severn, and lampreys, fresh from the river's weirs. Regulated by royal writ to ensure only the king's nets claimed the prime runs, their preparation overseen by the chamberlain, broiled in a sauce of verjuice and cinnamon, the spices' aroma mingling with the hall's incense to evoke exotic dominions. Henry, ever the strategist, used the feast as chess, toasts to his daughter Matilda's betrothal, sealing the succession against baronial whispers. He attacked the lampreys with relish, their slippery lengths vanishing down his throat, the richness a balm against the chill of impending civil war, his nephew Stephen already plotting across the Channel. Courtiers watched, envying the king's vigour, as minstrels plucked lutes to ballads of Arthur's endless horns of plenty. But as the night deepened, the assault turned inward. Indigestion gripped like a traitor's hand, the abdomen swelling, a burning that spread to limbs grown leaden. By morn, he writhed in his solar, physicians summoned from Oxford's nascent schools, bleedings with lancets, purges of rhubarb from Moorish gardens, futile against the toxins amassed, the lamprey's parasitic legacy or simple overload fermenting into sepsis, a gluttony of eels, the Anglo-Saxon chronicle intoned, a euphemism for the brutality. Fever racked him for 8 days, delirium conjuring ghosts of drowned sailors from the White Ship disaster of 1120, his only legitimate son's watery grave. Henry perished on December 1st, 1135, his body bloating in the December damp, the crown slipping to anarchy's grasp. 18 years of baronial wars that devoured the peace he had forged. These events, dissected in their intensity, the hunt's exhilaration yielding to rupture's flood, the hall's warmth curdling to solitary torment, reveal the rise not as ascent, but inexorable siege. Philip I of France, in 1108, echoed the pattern during a Lenten feast at Meaux, his Capetian piety fracturing under lamprey pies, meant to affirm alliances with Burgundian dukes. The surfeit twisted his frame, hastening a decline that left his line vulnerable to crusading sons. Each core moment, from forest glade to castle hearth, builds the drama. Preparations haste in kitchens, redolent of fish and fire, flavors seduction masking peril. The onset's inevitability as excess breached the body's ramparts. And in these falls, the paradox sharpens. Kings who commanded continents surrendered to the plate, their legacies not in stone but in the chronicler's hushed warnings of gluttony's blade. As we move from these visceral crescendos to the inner evolutions that some glimpsed too late, the melancholy deepens. The turn from blade to reflection, a fragile dawn amid the feast's encroaching night. From the shadowed precedents of William and Henry, where forest hunts and castle halls became theatres of unwitting self-sabotage, the pattern of royal ascent entwined ever tighter with the lamprey's insidious coil, pulling more monarchs into its depths across the fractured map of medieval Europe. Each rise, forged in the fires of conquest and consolidation, crested not in triumphant plateaus, but in the banquet's treacherous swell, where the very foods that symbolized dominion delivered the coup de grace. We turn now to Philip III of France, the Capetian scion, whose reign from 1060 to 1108 bridged the 11th century's turbulent dawn. A king whose early piety, christened the Pious for his monastic leanings, clashed with the appetites that ultimately unmade him, revealing the fragility beneath the fleur-de-lis. Envision the year 1108. The royal domain centered on the Île-de-France, a modest heartland amid the vast feudal patchwork where dukes of Aquitaine and Burgundy held sway like semi-independent kings. Their loyalties bought with marriages and maneuvers rather than mere fealty. Philip, at 56, had navigated a labyrinth of alliances. His divorce from Bertha of Holland to wed the fertile Bertrade de Montfort, a scandal that drew papal thunderbolts and excommunications, yet secured heirs like Louis VI, the future warrior king. His court at Meaux, a fortified abbey palace on the Marne's banks, pulsed with the machinery of expansion. Envoys from Flanders bearing tolls from wool trade, scribes tallying charters that extended Capetian influence toward the Loire's fertile bends. Spring had yielded to early summer, the air alive with the hum of bees and the distant lowing of herds driven to market, when a Lenten truce's end demanded a feast to reaffirm bonds with the recalcitrant Burgundian lords, whose support was vital against Norman encroachments across the Channel. The Great Hall, its vaulted timbers scarred by centuries of torch smoke, transformed into a stage of calculated splendor. Tapestries from Byzantine looms, gifts from earlier embassies, depicted David slaying Goliath, a subtle nod to Philip's own skirmishes against rebellious vassals like Hugh of Le Puiset, crushed in 1097's border affrays. Servants clad in the blue livery of the lilies bustled with platters. Loaves of manchet bread baked from the finest sifted flour, cheeses from Auvergne's pastures, veined with blue mold, and wine from the vineyards of Auxerre, its bouquet redolent of sun-ripened earth. Yet the stars of the board were the lampreys, dredged from the Marne's weirs under royal monopoly, edicts from Philip's chancellery ensuring only the king's nets claimed the spring migration, their harvest a perilous rite where fishermen balanced on precarious stakes, spears thrusting into the current's murk. These creatures, 7 to 10 inches of writhing menace, had been transported in willow baskets lined with damp moss, their survival a minor miracle in the pre-dawn carts that rattled from river to kitchen. Preparation unfolded in the scullery's stifling heat, where flames licked cauldrons suspended from iron hooks, the air thick with the acrid bite of vinegar and the cloying sweetness of honey from monastic hives. The lampreys were plunged alive into boiling water to loosen skins, then skinned with hooked blades that evoked the torturer's craft, their flesh exposed, pale and quivering, before being layered into pies with onions from Flemish gardens and a crust of pastry enriched with lard from royal swine. Spices elevated the humble to the exalted, grains of paradise from African coasts, smuggled via Genoese galleys, ground into a paste that masked the fish's innate chill, blending with the crust's golden bake until the pies emerged steaming, their aroma a seductive fog that drew courtiers like moths to flame. Philip, seated on a dais throne carved with biblical motifs, broke the first pie with ceremonial gravity, the crust yielding to reveal the coiled filling, juices pooling like spilled ink. He partook generously, the flaky texture giving way to the unctuous core. Earthy, almost fungal, with a slipperiness that clung to the palate, chased by sips of the tart wine that promised clarity, but delivered haze. The banquet stretched through the afternoon, laughter punctuating negotiations, oaths of mutual aid against the Holy Roman Empire's meddling, sealed with handclasps over the remnants. Philip, his piety a veneer over the monarch's pragmatism, invoked saints to bless the board. Yet his indulgence betrayed the contradictions. Church strictures on Lenten austerity bent for political necessity. The lampreys a fish exemption that blurred sin's boundaries. As dusk painted the hall in amber, the assault turned inward. A heaviness settled in his gut, the pie's weight fermenting into cramps that twisted like the river's eels themselves. By vespers, he retired to his chambers, the pain escalating to a vice around his vitals. Physicians, cloaked in the humoral lore of Salerno, prescribed emetics of theriac, an antidote paste of viper flesh and herbs, but the surfeit had breached deeper. Toxins, accumulated in the lamprey's river-fed flesh, perhaps heavy metals from upstream forges or bacterial blooms from the warm shallows, unleashed inflammation, his abdomen distending as if with child, fever visions of excommunicated ghosts haunting the candle-lit room. For days he lingered in torment. The court hushed as Burgundian envoys departed with uneasy glances, the fragile alliances cracking like the pie's crust. Chroniclers, like Guibert of Nogent, in his De Gesta per Francos, attributed it to divine ire for the royal adultery, a pious gloss on the raw physiology, the body's overload, phlegm overwhelming bile, leading to a cascade of weakness that sapped his already frail frame, ravaged by prior campaigns and the stresses of a contested marriage. Philip died on July 29, 1108, in the Priory of Melun, his passing a quiet unravelling that thrust the Capetian line toward Louis's iron rule, yet echoing the pattern, excess as the silent usurper, toppling thrones from within. And that changed everything. For in Philip's fall, the lamprey's shadow lengthened, a harbinger for emperors and kings alike. Nor did the peril spare the Holy Roman Empire's gilded cage, where Adolf of Nassau, elected king in 1292, amid the great interregnum's chaos, rose through electoral intrigue, only to meet his end in a banquet's deceptive embrace. Elected by the 7 prince-electors, archbishops and dukes whose votes were bartered like spices, the son of a minor noble from the Rhineland's mists ascended to counter the Hohenstaufen ghosts and Habsburg ambitions, his brief reign a whirlwind of consolidation. Alliances with the Teutonic Knights against Slavic frontiers, tolls levied on the Rhine's bustling barges laden with wool and wine. By 1298, at the Golfech River near Gölheim, his forces clashed with Adolf's rival, Albert of Habsburg, in a bid to secure the imperial mantle. But the prelude was a feast in the makeshift camp, a sprawl of tents amid the Palatinate's rolling vineyards, the air sharp with the scent of trampled grapes and horse sweat. Lampreys, sourced from the river's own depths, formed the repast's core. Netted in haste by foraging serfs, prepared over campfires in iron pots with verjuice and pepper, their stew a hasty unction for warriors' nerves. Adolf devoured them amid strategy talk, the fatty broth a fleeting comfort against the battle's loom, only for the surfeit to weaken him mid-charge, his horse faltering as cramps seized, a vulnerability that invited the Habsburg lance. Slain on the field, his death chronicled in the Annales Marbacenses as battle's toll, masked the deeper truth. The lamprey's grip, a prelude to doom, where excess eroded the frame before steel could strike. These core ascents, dissected in their sensory fury, the sizzle of preparation, the swallow's seduction, the betrayal's inexorable creep, illuminate the siege's universality. From Norman forests to Capetian abbeys to imperial fields, kings rose on waves of conquest, only for the banquet to crest into catastrophe, their bodies the true contested terrain. The paradox bites deep. Abundance, the crown's emblem, became its undoing, frailty mocking might in history's unyielding gaze. As these visceral dramas fade into the annals' hush, we descend to the philosophy and inner evolutions that flickered in some souls, a turn toward restraint or its tragic evasion, where reflection grappled with the appetites that defined and destroyed. From the visceral crescendos of hunts and halls, where the lamprey's unctuous embrace turned triumph into torment, a quieter storm brewed within the souls of these fallen monarchs, or in rarer cases, their wiser successors, a philosophical reckoning with the appetites that had forged and fractured their reigns. Here, In the dim-lit solas of later years, amid the crackle of parchment and the murmur of monastic advisors, some kings glimpsed the abyss of excess, turning from the banquet's siren call toward a fragile quest for inner equilibrium. Not enlightenment's radiant dawn, but a melancholy twilight, where humoral wisdom clashed with regal ego, restraint flickered like a candle against the wind of habit, and downfall loomed not as accident, but as the inexorable echo of unchecked indulgence. We probe these evolutions not as tidy conversions, but as tortured grapplings, contradictions laid bare, where the body's betrayal forced a mirror upon the mind, revealing the fragility beneath the crown's cold gleam. Consider Frederick II, the Stupa Mundi, wonder of the world, born in 1194 to the Hohenstaufen line, that emperor whose intellect pierced the medieval veil like a falcon's gaze through storm clouds, yet whose appetites mirrored the very excesses that had felled his forebears. Ascending in 1220, amid the Holy Roman Empire's fractious sprawl, from Sicilian sun-baked coasts to the Teutonic forests, he ruled as polymath and autocrat his court at Palermo, a crossroads of Arabic law, Greek philosophy, and Latin scholasticism, where falconers from Damascus mingled with translators poring over Aristotle's treatises. Frederick's early reign echoed the pattern. Grand feasts to bind Sicilian barons and German princes, lampreys dredged from the Strait of Messina's treacherous currents, prepared in almond milks infused with saffron from Moorish gardens, their oily richness a symbol of his multicultural dominion. Yet by his 40s, after the Sixth Crusade's diplomatic triumphs in 1229, securing Jerusalem without a blade, through negotiation's subtle art, the emperor confronted the toll. Campaigns had weathered his frame, prior indulgences leaving a legacy of gout that throbbed like distant thunder, and whispers from his physicians, drawing from Avicenna's canon. That Arabic beacon translated into Latin warned of the phlegmatic peril in cold, moist foods overwhelming the vital humours. In this inner forge, philosophy emerged as both salve and spectre. Frederick, ever the seeker, penned his De Arte Venandi cum Avibus, the art of hunting with birds, a treatise not merely on falconry, but on nature's balances, where the predator's discipline mirrored the ruler's need for restraint. He dissected the bird's flight as metaphor for the soul's ascent, arguing that excess dulled the senses as overfed hawks grew sluggish, their talons blunt from idleness. Lampreys, those abyssal predators he had once devoured to affirm his sea-girt empire, now appeared in his writings as cautionary emblems. Creatures of the deep, whose voracious maws accumulated toxins from the riverbed's detritus, a parallel to the monarch's court, where flattery's poisons seeped into the spirit. Influenced by his Saracen tutors, figures like the eunuch physician Ibn al-Sikili, who prescribed regimens of moderation drawn from Galen, Frederick experimented with restraint. Lenten fasts extended beyond ecclesiastical decree, banquets paired to simples like barley broth, and river trout lightly grilled. The lamprey banished to the periphery as a relic of youthful hubris. This evolution was no serene pivot, but a psychological siege. Traumas of his mother's early death, the investiture's inherited scars, and excommunications from popes like Gregory IX, who branded him Antichrist for his secular curiosities, all converging to fracture the ego that once equated abundance with divinity. Irony coiled through his quest like the lamprey itself. The emperor who corresponded with the Caliph of Baghdad on astrology's harmonies, who established the University of Naples in 1224 to distill knowledge from chaos, could not fully exorcise the feast's ghost. In 1235, at the Diet of Mainz, amid negotiations with fractious electors over imperial taxes, a ceremonial repast tempted him. Lamprey pies, offered as tribute from Rhineland abbeys, their crusts gilded with edible gold leaf to honor his splendor. He partook sparingly, yet the old seduction stirred. the flavors evoking boyhood's defiant swallows amid Sicilian intrigue. The aftermath was a harbinger, cramps that echoed his forebears' falls, a fever that confined him to bed while envoys waited in the antechamber, his body rebelling as if the humours, long suppressed, rose in vengeful flood. Physicians bled him under astrological auspices, Mercury retrograde demanding balance. But the episode etched a deeper melancholy, prompting treatises on dietetics where he framed gluttony as the soul's eclipse, the table a battlefield where will ward with want. Frederick's inner turn, from power's gluttonous blaze to philosophical dusk, embodied the era's contradictions. Church doctrines urging temperance per St. Benedict's rule, clashing with feudal customs that crowned the feast as fealty's seal, leaving him a figure adrift, enlightened in mind, yet ensnared by the flesh's frail inheritance. This grappling echoed in lesser lights, like Louis IX of France, the saintly Capetian who reigned from 1226 to 1270, his evolution a bridge from ancestral excess to ascetic dawn, though not without shadows. Scarred by the Albigensian Crusade's brutal inheritance, his grandfather Philip Augustus's campaigns against Cathar heretics, Louis inherited a court where lampreys from the Seine symbolized the realm's watery veins. Yet piety, forged in the trauma of his father's early death and the baron's plots of 1226, turned him inward. Advisors like Robert of Sorbonne, founder of the Sorbonne, steeped him in Thomistic philosophy, where Aquinas's Summa Theologica dissected the virtues, framing gluttony as a vice that distorted the will toward God. Lewis's feasts evolved, from opulent Yule banquets in the 1230s, laden with eels in Galantine, to the 1240s restrained tables, bread, wine and fish in moderation, the lamprey relegated to alms for the poor, its peril a parable in his confessional whispers. During the Seventh Crusade in 1248, aboard galleys bound for Egypt, he fasted amid the stench of bilge and salted provisions, reflecting on the body's transience in letters to his mother Blanche, abundance as illusion, the soul's true feast in charity's quiet grace. Yet even he faltered, returning fevered from Damietta's sands, a 1249 indulgence in Nile perch and spiced conserves, echoing the lamprey's chill, nearly claiming him before saintly resolve pulled back. In these evolutions, grandeur mingles with melancholy, the turn from excess a fragile reed bending before history's gale. Frederick's intellectual flight, Lewis's saintly pivot, each a revelation born of near ruin, where philosophy pierced the veil of power to expose human fragility. Paradoxically, restraint came too late or too tentatively, the body's accumulated betrayals lingering like river silt, ensuring downfall's shadow. For in grappling with the inner tempests, these kings confronted not just appetites, but the eternal human coil, the hunger that builds empires devours their masters. And in that introspection, the lamprey's lesson whispers eternal, moderation glimpsed in twilight, forever eludes the throne's unyielding grasp. From the flickering introspection of emperors and saints, where restraint dawned like a hesitant moon over the banquet's ruins, the lamprey's shadow stretched beyond the medieval veil, embedding itself in the annals of legacy, a spectral thread woven through chronicles, canvases, and the modern gaze, where history's brutality confronts our own illusions of mastery over the flesh. These kings, felled not by arrows or intrigue, but by the fork's quiet thrust, left a heritage laced with melancholy grandeur, their falls, once veiled in pious euphemisms, now dissected under the harsh light of reinterpretation, revealing not divine caprice, but the inexorable grind of human excess. In books that gathered dust on monastic shelves and later bloomed in Renaissance print, in films that cast royal halls in celluloid splendor, in pop culture's voracious maw, and in academia's probing scalpels, the deadly food endures, a paradox preserved, its oily whisper challenging us to confront the fragility we inherit. The legacy begins in the ink of contemporaries, those chroniclers who inscribed the falls with a restraint born of awe and fear, their quills scratching across vellum in cloistered scriptoria, where candle flames danced like uneasy souls. Orderic Vitalis, that Benedictine monk of Shrewsbury whose ecclesiastical history spanned the 12th century's tumults, captured William the Conqueror's rupture in the New Forest not as mere gluttony, but as heaven's lash for earthly sins, the harrying of the north a prelude to the lamprey's internal siege, his body spilling upon the soil like a sacrificial libation to the land's aggrieved spirits. Similarly, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that terse chain of annals from monastic hands, noted Henry's 1135 surfeit with stark brevity. "The king died of gluttony," a phrase that echoed through later compilations like Matthew Paris's Chronica Majora, where the lamprey became emblem of hubris, its serpentine form sketched in marginalia as a devilish tempter coiled around the throne. These medieval texts, illuminated with gold leaf and rubricated initials, romanticized the feasts as divine affirmations even as they hinted at peril. Lampreys elevated to symbols of royal reach, their harvest regulated in charters that outlived the king's, binding rivers like the Severn in perpetual servitude. Yet beneath the hagiography lurked the unspoken excess as the true regicide, a lesson buried in Latin phrases, lest it undermined the divine right's fragile scaffold. As the Renaissance stirred Europe's intellect from scholastic slumber, these tales resurfaced in printed tomes that peeled back the pious gloss, transforming veiled tragedies into cautionary mirrors for emerging absolutists. In 1533, François Rabelais's Gargantua and Pantagruel mocked the medieval banquet's bloat through the giant king's insatiable maw, lamprey-like eels devoured in parody of Henry's end, their excess a satirical jab at the humoral follies that Rabelais, trained as a physician, dissected with anatomical glee. Montaigne's essays, penned in the late 16th century amid France's wars of religion, reflected on these royal downfalls philosophically. In Of Experience, he pondered the body's betrayal, likening the lamprey's toxins to fortune's caprice, arguing that true wisdom lay in moderation's quiet sovereignty over the throne's clamour. By the Enlightenment, Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, though focused on antiquity, drew parallels in footnotes to medieval gluttonies, framing the lamprey as a barbaric relic persisting into Christian courts, a bridge from imperial decadence to feudal frailty. These books, bound in calfskin and disseminated by Aldine presses, shifted the narrative from moral fables to human inquiries, where the deadly food symbolized not God's wrath but nature's indifferent blade, cutting down the mighty with the same inexorability that felled peasants in plague-ridden hovels. In the silver flicker of cinema, this legacy casts long shadows across screens, where directors summon the medieval hall's opulence to underscore tragedy's bite. The 1968 film The Lion in Winter, with Peter O'Toole as Henry II, echoing his grandfather's Angevin appetites, depicts Christmas court at Chinon in 1183, tables groaning under implied excesses like spiced eels, the dialogue laced with barbs that hint at the surfeit's looming spectre. Peter's Henry snarls of inheritance's poisons, a subtle nod to the lamprey's historical grip on the line. Ridley Scott's Kingdom of Heaven, 2005, evokes Frederick II's balanced feasts amid crusade diplomacy, lamprey substitutes in Sicilian spreads, symbolizing the Stupa Mundi's intellectual restraint, yet underscoring the era's humoral tensions through Bailion's ascetic counterpoint. Even in animated realms, Disney's The Sword in the Stone, 1963, whimsically alludes to Arthurian banquets overburdened with river fare, Merlin's warnings a light veil over the darker truths of excess drawn from Malory's Morte d'Arthur, where feasts precede falls. These films, with their sweeping scores and torchlit grandeur, romanticize the peril, lampreys absent in explicit form, but their essence in the visual excess. Platters that gleam like false jewels, foreshadowing the body's quiet rupture. Pop culture devours this heritage with modern hunger, repurposing the lamprey's lore in novels, games, and media that blend historical grit with fantastical dread. George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series, birthing HBO's Game of Thrones, mirrors the pattern in feasts like the Red Wedding's Horrors or Joffrey's Wedding Pie, eels and doves evoking lamprey pies. Their toxicity, a narrative device for royal poisonings that nod to medieval surfeits. Excess as the undercurrent to Westeros's thrones. In video games like Assassin's Creed, Valhalla 2020, Viking raids yield eel halls transformed into Anglo-Saxon banquets. Side quests unearthing chronicles of William's hunt. The player's immersion in the New Forest's gloom, a tactile echo of the conqueror's last revel. Graphic novels such as The Last Days of the Romanovs twist the motif forward, but medieval echoes persist in works like Alan Moore's Promethea, where alchemical feasts symbolize humoral imbalance, lampreys as archetypes of devouring knowledge. Misconceptions thrive here. Pop culture often casts these deaths as assassinations or curses, lampreys romanticized as exotic thrills, their lethality diluted to dramatic flair, ignoring the forensic banality of overconsumption's toll. Academia, in its lantern-lit seminars and peer-reviewed tomes, offers the sharpest reinterpretations, a sifting myth from marrow with tools unknown to medieval scribes. Historians like Mark Bloch in Feudal Society, 1939, framed the surfeits as cultural artifacts of feudal display, lampreys as prestige markers in a zero-sum economy where abundance signaled power amid scarcity's spectre. Medical scholars, drawing from toxicology's modern lens, debate the physiology. Studies in the Journal of the History of Medicine 2005 analyzed lamprey flesh for bioaccumulated heavy metals, mercury from industrial river pollution precursors, parasites like nematodes fostering sepsis, positing Henry's fever as botulism from anaerobic spoilage, not mere overload. Debates rage. Was it divine judgment, as chroniclers claimed, or environmental peril? Revisionists like Judith Bennett in Medieval Women argued gender dynamics veiled male gluttony, queens like Matilda enduring the aftermath of kings' indulgences in anarchic voids. Misconceptions persist. Popular histories like Alison Weir's Eleanor of Aquitaine overemphasize intrigue, downplaying the body's role. While eco-historians in Simon Schama's Landscape and Memory, 1995, recast lamprey harvests as ecological hubris, overfishing royal rivers a metaphor for monarchy's unsustainable grasp. In this mosaic of legacy, grandeur and melancholy entwine, books that immortalize the fall, films that dramatize its splendor, pop culture that devours its essence, academia that unmasks its truths. The lamprey endures not as villain, but as mirror, reflecting our own excesses, the paradox that abundance, history's glittering lure, devours unchecked. Debates linger, misconceptions fade under scrutiny, yet the lesson whispers eternal. Even in reinterpretation, the throne's fragility mocks our illusions of control. And that changed everything. For in remembering these kings' silent sieges, we glimpse our shared unraveling, the deadly food, a timeless sentinel against the feast's false promise. In the hush that follows the clamor of feasts long dissolved, where the echoes of clinking goblets fade into the stone vaults of forgotten keeps, we linger on the threshold of what these royal unravelings truly unveil, not merely the fall of crowns, but the profound fragility woven into the very sinew of power itself. Picture the scene one final time. A king, solitary now in the fever's grip, his chambers dim to a single taper's glow, the air thick with the residue of spices and regret. The lamprey's oily ghost lingers on his palate, a final betrayal from the depths, as visions of conquered realms blur into the sweat-dampened linens. This is no triumphant close to an era's saga, but a melancholy epilogue where history's grandeur crumbles to reveal the human pulse beneath, beating, frail, inexorable in its surrender to appetites that promise eternity yet deliver dust. The paradox cuts deepest here in the quiet aftermath, those who commanded the world's hungers, extracting tribute from trembling lands, binding vassals with the chains of fealty sworn over laden boards, proved most vulnerable to the hunger within. Abundance, that glittering emblem of divine favor, the very currency of medieval kingship, twisted into annihilation's subtle blade. William, spilling his empire's lifeblood upon the new forest's indifferent earth. Henry, writhing in Gloucester's shadows as anarchy stirred in the void he left. Philip, his Capetian piety undone by the Marne's serpentine bounty. Even the enlightened Frederick, whose philosophical flights could not outrun the body's accumulated shadows. Each, in their ascent, had wielded the feast as scepter, a ritual defying the famines that gnawed at their realm's edges, the plagues that thinned monastic ranks, the winters that froze rivers into mirrors of scarcity. Yet in that defiance lay the illusion's core. The throne, for all its iron and gold, rested not on unassailable might, but on the precarious balance of a mortal frame, one surfeit away from rupture. Reflect then on the brutality of it, not the spectacle of battles, with their banners torn and fields churned to mud, but the intimate savagery of self-inflicted siege. The lamprey, that ancient predator dredged from abyssal currents, embodied this truth. A creature of survival's edge, its rasping maw adapted to the riverbed's detritus, accumulating perils in flesh that humans, in hubris, claimed as delicacy. Harvested under royal edict, transported in baskets that mimicked the coffin's weave, prepared in kitchens redolent of fire and haste. Its richness seduced the senses, masking the toxins that bloomed like unseen foes. Mercury from upstream forges, parasites coiled in fatty tissues, the sheer volume overwhelming humoral equilibria preached by Galen and Avicenna, but ignored in the ego's blaze. No assassin's cunning, no rival's arrow. The killer was complicity, the king's own hand lifting the fork, swallow by swallow, until the body rebelled, not with a roar, but a whisper of inevitability, guts twisting like the eels themselves in final futile thrash. This lesson, etched across centuries from Carolingian hearths to Hohenstaufen-Sohlers, carries a philosophical weight that transcends the medieval gloom, inviting us to confront our own shadowed banquets. In an age of our own excesses, where tables groan not with lampreys but with processed abundances, global supply chains mimicking the Silk Road's perilous reach, we glimpse the echo. The greater the illusion of mastery over scarcity, the closer the echo of downfall. History, that midnight chronicler, offers no sermons, only mirrors. In these kings' falls, we see not distant tragedies, but the human condition's eternal coil, the fragility that unites peasant and prince, the melancholy truth that power's feast devours its host. Grandeur built on indulgence crumbles inward, leaving legacies not of unyielding stone, but of whispered warnings in the annals. Moderation, that elusive virtue, forever the throne's absent guardian. Yet there is a deeper introspection here, a poetic undercurrent to the brutality, where loss begets revelation. Imagine the souls of these monarchs adrift in delirium's tide. William, gasping on the litter to Rouen, perhaps glimpsing the harrying's ghosts in the forest's sway. Henry, fevered visions of the white ship's waves merging with the lamprey's chill, a reckoning for sons lost and empires fractured. Even in downfall, a quiet evolution stirs, not redemption's blaze, but a subdued wisdom, the body's agony stripping away the divine right's veneer to expose the shared mortality beneath. The Church, with its fasts and purges, had preached this. Philosophers like Boethius, in his Consolation of Philosophy amid Ostrogothic captivity, had framed fortune's wheel turning against the mighty. But only in the surfeit's vice did it pierce the royal psyche, a final lesson in humility. Abundance mocks the soul that seeks eternity in the ephemeral, the feast a fleeting sacrament yielding to the grave's unyielding feast. And so we close this shadowed excavation, the candle of inquiry guttering low, leaving you with the paradox that lingers like smoke from ancient fires. In the heart of excess, history reveals not the strength of kings, but the quiet rebellion of the flesh they could not command. The lamprey, slithering from myth to mortality, stands as sentinel, a reminder that true dominion lies not in devouring the world, but in tempering the devouring within. For in understanding these silent sieges, we arm ourselves against our own hungers, confronting the melancholy grandeur of lives led on the edge of indulgence's abyss. The thrones may fall, the rivers run eternal, but the lesson endures. Unchecked abundance is the deadliest crown of all, and that, in the end, changes everything.